Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Bari Norman from Expert Admissions, and we are here again with an initial wrap up of the early cycle for this 2022-2023 admissions year, academic year. I'm joined by my colleagues and friends, Sasha DeWind and Leslie Singer, who are going to be moderating and joining me in sharing information with you. A couple of housekeeping items as people are queuing into the room. We do encourage, we have great questions that you submitted in advance. Thank you so much. We also encourage you to ask questions live as we go. If you can put that in the Q&A section, that would be most helpful. I'll be looking and keeping an eye on that as we're chatting. And thank you so much again for joining us. There are still people queuing into the room. I will turn this over to Leslie.
Okay. Should we give it another couple seconds or yes?
Hang on, we actually have a couple people who raised their hand. Let's see.
Okay.
And
maybe let's make sure that they can get in.
That's right.
And then we can.
No, I think we're good.
Okay. So as Barry already said, hi, I'm Leslie Singer of Brown Harris Stevens, and I will be moderating this evening. And I am so lucky to be with these two lovely ladies. So it's my pleasure to be working with Dr. Bari Norman, who is the co-founder and head counselor of Expert Admissions, and Sasha DeWind, who is the CEO of Tutor Associates. To start off the evening, I think what we would like to do is just do a poll to start. And here we go. This helps us.
I love seeing the combination of students and parents. All right, so what grade are you or your student in? All right, it looks like, as we suspected, we've got a majority, about 60% 11th graders, followed by 10th graders, followed by 12th graders, and then a good portion of other. So welcome everybody, but we've got mostly juniors. We'll keep that in mind while we're speaking. We have a nice percentage of sophomores as well. And we know that there are seniors out there who are very curious how the cycle is going and how it is in progress and what that will mean for regulars. So we'll keep it all in mind.
Okay, well, I'm going to start out with an SAT and ACT question. Are schools really agnostic between SAT and ACT, and how and when do you choose?
Yeah, I mean, that's very sort of simple answer on this one. They are truly agnostic. They're looking for high scores, and it's always been true, and it is certainly true today that they have no preference between the SAT and the ACT. We all individually should have preferences. Each child should have a preference. You should pick one and never two. And you know, sophomore year is usually the time to start exploring the right test for you, maybe spring of sophomore year. For some kids, that's the summer before 11th grade. There's no one size fits all, but 10th grade's the time to start planning. And it's about taking those diagnostics and fully understanding which path is right for you, and then moving forward with that one path.
Barry, I have a feeling that for the 12th graders, they're going to be very curious to know, what have you seen so far this admissions cycle? Have there been any surprises?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's probably the most common one that I get asked around this time of year, not surprisingly. So what I would say, generally speaking, short answer is no crazy surprises, which is a wonderful thing. We've had a couple of years that have been certainly more volatile, I'll say, which is putting it generously. And it was really wonderful to see decisions come back as we would expect. That doesn't mean that everybody gets what they want and what they were hoping for, but it does mean that the things that do come back make sense. And that was a wonderful thing to see. So I hope, I don't want to, no jinxing, but I hope it's a signal that things are starting to even out a bit, which even though things have absolutely, and we'll talk about this later, gotten harder, that them being more predictable is still a good thing. So things can get more difficult, but also be more predictable at the same time. The predictability is what helps you best in your strategy. And so that was a really nice thing to see. And that was something that we saw at Expert Admissions. It's also something when checking in with colleagues in our area and around the country, similar kinds of feedback. So we'll see. We still have some EA decisions that are still not out yet. We've got ED2 coming out in the next week or so, and we have regular decisions. So jury's still out, but hopefully a signal of what's to come.
Do you have any observations about test optional admissions and or submissions do they benefit students, and if score ranges moved north? And I think it's actually a question for both of you can talk to, please.
Yeah, I can start and just share that, you know, again, the data that's out so far is limited because we're really mid-cycle. I do have some, I think, very helpful statistics to share about application numbers and admit rates relative to last year in the early decision and early action pools, and happy to share as we're moving along as it makes sense. But one of those statistics, so Duke shared a nice amount of data actually after their early round. In their situation, it was 60% of applicants in early decisions submitted scores, 70% of admitted students in early decisions submitted scores. Their mid 50%, it's still moving because it's, you know, it's in progress, but 1510 to 1520 to 1560, 1570. Not surprising that part of the question about scores moving north, the answer is yes. That's one big change that's happened of many as a result of test optional. So what essentially ended up happening is that when schools went test optional, the only people who really, not only the people who had good advice, the only people, you know, who were submitting were people who were on the upper end of the old ranges. And that, by the way, that was the general advice pre-pandemic, you know, don't submit if you're at the bottom end. So people were submitting at the top, and then the ones who just weren't there didn't submit. That basically created a much narrower range of what the scores that they were seeing look like. And it absolutely pushed the mid 50% up a lot, and by a lot at many schools. Duke's mid 50% for the ACT was 34 to 36. You know, again, not surprising, but the crazy thing is that you can be sitting there with a 1500 and actually not submit, and it might actually make sense for you not to submit, which I hate to say. It makes me feel so ick to say it. But it's a question you actually have to ask yourself, which again is incredible. But it is something you need to decide. The answer is always not going to be yes. It's not going to be no. But you really have to think about, you know, in that pool, given what they're seeing, am I coming in as a stronger submitter or not? And one thing that we have seen is for students, if the fit is there, if you can deliver what they're looking for, it doesn't matter if you submit scores or not, but everything else has to be there. It's like, you can't just say, oh, I'm just going to take the score piece out of it. If everything else isn't exactly where it needs to be, and that goes beyond just checking boxes. This is about fit. This is about conveying things in the essays differently to different schools. I mean, there's a lot that goes into it, but if those marks you hit all those marks, not submitting scores shouldn't really impact your decision. So I'll stop because Sasha, I'm sure, has some other things to add.
Really, I have only to echo Bari. So I'll just keep it brief, which is that I have seen this inflation over the last 15 years. It was steady and quiet. It is now big, and it's not going anywhere. There's nowhere else to go with the bubble, because when Bari says that the 50% are within 34 to 36, I mean, really it's 75% at that point, because you can't do better than 36 on the ACT. So when I know we just like top these scores, but 36 is a perfect score on the ACT. And what that means is very few students were admitted with scores under a 34. Some didn't send scores at all. That 40% didn't send scores, but 70% of admitted students did send scores. And the scores you're seeing, for exactly the reasons Bari said, are quite inflated. That's been happening. That was a trend that test optional started a while ago. And now the landscape, it's sort of like it's flooded with it, right? So you just get it everywhere. And so what that means is that Bari's talking strategy. Once you have the scores, you have the 1500, is that the right thing to do for your application at Duke versus at Michigan versus somewhere else, right? And it's a very specific strategy, school by school. As you think about whether or not your child needs scores, period, they don't need them in all likelihood, right? There's a largely test optional landscape with a few schools that require, but the statistics are sort of speak for themselves in terms of who's admitted at certain institutions. And I think for me, it's about positioning us to have choices and understanding what the opportunity cost of those scores is. For some kids, it's not worth it. And I think that's more true now than ever before. Of course, there are kids for whom test optional is a huge benefit and a really important piece of this. But for most kids, they want to show those scores, especially kids who go to top schools, who have the opportunity to prepare, who have access to tutoring and to practice tests. There's not barriers in the way. That's what you're sort of planning for. And then when you get to the end, you're strategizing. That's what I see our families doing, and they're facing huge inflation on the score end. So we're very clear, if you're not hitting that whatever inflated score, it's not helping. We don't do it. It's not just for fun. And I will note that for some of our families, for scholarships, other numbers are important. We're talking about just admissions. There are scholarships that specifically want 24s, 25s, 26s. That's a different kind of thing. But overwhelmingly, yes, we're seeing a huge bubble.
Going back though, when do kids normally test? When do kids normally test, and do you have to send the scores? And that's slightly different than test optional.
Yeah, there's fortunately this is so different in high school admissions, but in college admissions, there's such a long window of normal for when you might be taking an official ACT or SAT. Remember, we're not doing both. But there's a long window. I have everything from kids who have really intense, they're going away for spring semester and they know they have summer before junior year to prep, and they're going to really go for those early fall junior year tests. And they may be exceptions, but that's right for their lives. It's right for their programs. Much more broadly, kids are testing in the winter and the spring of junior year, and certainly into the summer and fall of senior year. And the question is really individual for when. It comes down to so many things, your course load, your sports schedule, when you're starting, how far away from the goals are you? What's your summer like? Are you away on that July ACT date? Are you going to be jet lagged? We've dealt with jet lag kids in July. So each child needs to have a plan that makes sense, but anywhere between the fall of junior year all the way through the fall of senior year, we have kids testing, and it's just largely variable depending on the child.
Yeah, I would add, I agree completely. One thing I think can be tough is when other people are testing early around you, and they may or not be done early, that there's a feeling that you're behind, or and there's nothing could be further from the truth, because nobody cares when anybody takes the test. Nobody's looking at that. There's no assessment made based on how early the score is coming. I mean, none of that. You do it truly at your pace, so you can hit the highest that you can hit. Most people need more like runway. They need time, and you can't rush it. You could tutor 1,000,000 hours. I think Sasha would say that it's not like, okay, if at the end of the day you were going to be tutoring for 100 hours, if you did the 100 hours over 4 months versus 8 months, you're not going to see the same results. Like developmentally, there's more to offer. You're getting more knowledge, you're maturing. There's all different things. So I discourage people from being too quick unless you're a naturally gifted test taker, where you're kind of those one and done. You start out essentially close to where you need to be. Otherwise, it really is slow and steady wins the race. You don't want to burn out. You don't want to be going for so long and then be discouraged because you're not seeing the bump that really just requires time. It's nothing you're doing. You just need a little bit more time. The other thing to mention as a follow-up, Sasha, to what you were just saying previously, when deciding about scores or no scores, I'd always rather be able to give scores when we can. It's just that when we can't, we're not, because we don't want it to work against you. You also have to remember that your list is going to have a range of schools on it. So oftentimes students might be submitting to some of their schools and not to others. So yeah, maybe the score isn't good enough for your reach school and you're not going to submit there, but you've got some targets or even ones that we're hoping are going to be more likely for you, where it absolutely can increase your chances. And I think one thing we know post-pandemic is that fewer and fewer schools are as straightforward for high achieving students within that pool. So there are fewer schools where you can kind of just say, listen, if you're at this level, like, we can count on that coming through. They're more discerning with the kids that are using them as what we would have called previously sort of safer options. And so the scores can really work to your benefit in a different way when you think about the list more broadly.
And I wanted to go back to the sort of when to take it. I want, I think about my own daughter. I was just talking, she's in 3rd grade, so she doesn't have to worry about this yet, but I was thinking about, I really do think, well, what would I do for her? What are the things I think about these tests? And I really truly think it's a lot like a language, a new language. And so if you think about, if your child doesn't speak, any foreign language, doesn't speak Spanish, and you're starting from nowhere and you need to learn Spanish, you need to do it consistently. You need to do it without burnout. You need to do it thoughtfully. You'll need to perform in this specific way. There's more to it than just learning a language, but learning a language takes time. And as Bari said, some kids are starting in different places in sort of that language, right? They might already be pretty fluent. They may truly be starting at the beginning. And I do believe that you can teach that language to a child. I really do believe that. And I think the language has many components, and I think performance is a piece of it. I think there's other pieces that are skill-based, and there are other pieces that are pattern based, I guess I would say, but it's a language and your child can learn it. But some need longer to learn it fluently, and some are closer. And I think that that's where we adjust around that child's needs, developmental and otherwise.
Bari, you touched upon this a bit. So do you have to send the scores? And Sasha, you can answer that as well.
Generally speaking, the answer is no. There's always Georgetown, the exception to every rule, but really no. And when you're filling out the Common App, so it depends what your list of schools entails, but for a pretty broad range of schools, most of them, almost all of them, will be self-reporting scores, which means that you don't send official scores until you decide where you're enrolling, and they go through a verification process at the end just to ensure that you've reported properly if you are submitting. And so on the Common App for ACT, they're asking for highest section scores and the highest single composite. So you don't get to put the super score on the Common App. You put the highest single composite, and then if they super score, they'll do that on their end. But the short answer is really no, with very few exceptions. You do not have to send all scores. And, you want to be strategic about when you take the test so you don't burn out and you don't get discouraged by logging official scores that might be lower. Take these practice tests, listen to your tutors, take their, guidance and advice about sort of and we also advise on, when to take, when to stop because it's not worth it, or stop because it's good enough. You've cleared the bar. More is not going to get you anything else. Put your time into other stuff that's actually going to make a difference, like how you're engaging in your extracurriculars or, your classes or whatever. So short answer is no. And also a question came in on the Q&A, just is it really test optional for a private school applicant? Feels like it's a must and they will be penalized if not submitting. You're not going to be penalized for not submitting like as a blanket statement. Again, I'd like to give scores when we can, but if you can't, then you don't, and you're better for it than if you had to submit. So you don't want to submit scores that are going to actively make it easy for them to say, no, thank you. And I can give so many examples of students who submitted to highly selective schools and were admitted. And I can also give you a lot of examples where I wish we had some scores to give, so you do your best and you try. But as a blanket statement, no, just because you go to private school doesn't mean you have to submit scores or that you should. But certainly demographics, there, I think, are some expectations to some degree, but again, I can give you so many examples of test optional kids who were successful, who had no barrier to anything. So, you got to do what's best.
Which, by the way, is exactly why the admin rates go down, and this all works because they are admitting students who are not sending scores. Duke just said 30% of their admitted students did not send scores, right? And that's substantial, and that's why it's harder to be in Duke's that's why their applicants have gone up, their admit rates go down. This is the bubble we're sort of talking about, but it does require the schools to actually be test optional. And they are. The ones who are test optional. And Bari and I have been relieved at that when that's the right fit for a child who doesn't have the right scores. And we always want to position our children to have as many options as possible from the get-go. So when you're planning to send scores. That's not always the way it needs to work or the way that it will strategically work. And if you don't have the scores to send, you're not sending scores. And I think that's so important. And you can do that now. Before you had to send them even when they were going to wipe you out. And now you don't. And so I don't want that to get lost in the fact that clearly scores are ideal in many situations. There really is this new thing happening, and that's why this bubble exists.
Can either of you, because Bari used the word, just in case anyone doesn't know, what is the definition of super scoring?
Sure, I can talk about the actual super scoring, and Bari can say again what she means about the self-reporting, because I did catch that, but it's a subtlety. It's a subtlety. So super scoring is really mixing and matching of scores across different test dates. So you take the test in, April, and you take it again in June, and you go up a little in one way and down, and you mix and match, and you get a super score. I mean, that's what it simply means. It's really just like a better score that's a mix and match. And it is widely accepted and certainly encouraged by the College Board and by the ACT. They very much want the super scores to be accepted, and many colleges will allow you to mix and match scores. And Bari will speak to what they see and what they don't see in a moment. But that is a widely practiced thing, actually, and at this point on the ACT too. I mean, more on the SAT than the ACT, but really on both tests, you see it widely used. Some schools say we don't do it. So it really does come down to your school list. There will be schools that say, we are not going to mix and match and average a higher score for you, or average a higher composite, or look at a higher SAT score. So that's school by school, but it is quite literally the mixing and matching of multiple official test date scores to make this better overall score, or this better average score. And then Bari's going to go back to, well, how do they actually do it, and what do they see, and is it a good idea to super score, which is a different question.
Yeah, so with the super scoring, like Sasha said, SAT, kind of the law of the land for SAT has been super scoring forever. Like, even for the parents listening, they super scored when we applied, like they're still doing the same thing. And it's sort of regular practice. With the ACT, it's something that's come more slowly and gradually over time. And it really kind of went over more post-pandemic in a test optional world. If you're test optional, then it's kind of odd to be like, yes, and you have to submit all scores, right? There's flexibility inherently in being test optional, but there are some places that will require it. So it is always a kind of college admissions, it depends. But generally speaking, there are many schools that will allow you to super score. When you're self-reporting, and self-reporting is another policy that's more starting pre-pandemic, but it kind of took off after the pandemic, where instead of having to submit official scores from either the College Board, which is SAT or ACT, you self-report, you enter them in manually on your Common App. It shows up there, and the admissions officer reads it, sees those scores, and uses that for their decision making. Some schools will see different sets of scores. Some schools just see the composite. I mean, it really varies how they generate the data and set it up on their end. So you should just assume they're seeing each of the sections that you report, and that's that. Because if you get something more generous, great, but you don't want to make any assumptions. When you're self-reporting the SAT scores, they're just asking for highest, verbal, English-based reading and writing. They're asking for the highest math. When it's the ACT, we've got 4 sections, and then we've also got a composite score, which is the average of the 4 sections on a single test. On the Common App, they ask you for your highest English, your highest reading, your highest math, and your highest science. And then the language is your highest composite. It's a single composite. They ask for the date associated with it. So you can't super score yourself. You do actually show the highest composite. If a school super scores, they'll take your highest ones and they'll, put it in their little computer, and then they'll come up with your super score. So you have to realize what cards you're required to show and how it shows. There's other kind of variations in data and how it's seen and what's seen and what's not seen on the other end. It's best always to be conservative and assume that you're showing, each of those sections, you're showing your highest composite, which still makes it so that with your tutor, you're working to hit really on a single day, the composite, as opposed to, going for high section scores, but having lower composites overall. You'll run into trouble there, certainly at highly selective schools, but even at ones that you probably don't think are such sticklers either.
And it can get very tricky when you get down to the 33 on the science and the 36 and 236 here, but the science was the 31 and their composites. And I mean, this is where the strategy comes in, but that's all after the fact, right? So when you're planning ahead, and for our juniors, and I'm going to talk about the new SAT as well for our sophomores, but for our kids who are still in it, and they really do you'll have a lot of control over your scores. And we are going for a concise testing portfolio. That's a Bari Norman phrase. I use it all the time. I want a concise testing portfolio. So does she. It does not always work out. Sometimes you're mixing and matching, and that's fine. Sometimes that's on the SAT, sometimes it's on the ACT, but we're going for, and really what I think Bari and I always agree on is we're not going for a kid just doing this over and over again. It happens, but it pains us because we want our kids, as Bari said, moving on to other things, doing this in a consistent way that makes sense, not taking big breaks and coming back to it and dragging it out. So when things go right, we want a couple official tests, and you send the best one, or you send the best couple if you're super scoring.
Yeah, it's definitely something where you take the gift that testing is one of the few things that it really is a box checker. Once you hit a certain point, checked it, I can move on. Most everything else, it's about doing it deeper, better, more engaged, more specific, or more nuanced, whatever. This, you actually have a pretty clear barometer, and you can check it off, and that's good enough. So to me, that's a gift. Take it. And
so Bari, there's a question just about that in the chat that I would love your answer on, but I think I know, which is about, are there too high scores, not for your target, for your likelies, not for your reaches, but are there scores that are ever too good to send?
No.
That's what I was about to say. No, there's never too good scores.
Again, you give good scores, you're not a good fit for a school you think is safe, you're not getting in. Those days are over. That was a gift that used to exist. It no longer is available.
But scores are not the problem there, just to be clear. They didn't say this is too high, this must be a safety. That doesn't exist.
Your grades are going to be the bigger thing, right? And by the way, there's so many people like you, whatever pool you're that rock star in, numbers wise, there are usually, depending on how big the school is, thousands, tens of thousands like you. In this world, there's so many of those people who, by the way, of course they're on your list. They should be. That's how you make a responsible list. If you didn't have schools that you thought were more attainable for you, it would be unwise, as an applicant, but they don't have the room for all of you. So again, the fit is going to come into play even with your safer options, which again, not all that long ago, we had so many schools that just did it more straightforwardly. If you were kind of at this point, we knew it'll come through. Just times have changed, and it's not that long ago that schools that would have been that are no longer. And some of the stats that I have, you can see that, if you have an older sibling who's 2 or 3 years older than you, that's as if it was in another lifetime, practically, when you look at the numbers for some of these schools. And so the comparisons can be hard to make and can be a little bit confusing. But I would never not send a score because it's too high. I would reconsider a safer or more likely option because you're not a good fit and they don't think you're going to go because it's not a good fit, not because you're sort of too high.
Kind of what you were talking about makes a nice segue into what weight you're saying the landscape is changing, what weight does legacy currently carry in today's admissions, and how will it be affected by the likely end of affirmative action?
So it depends on the school. There are schools where we've certainly seen a pull away from it. And then there are schools that are still utilizing it in much the same way they've had historically. One thing that I know is that so many of the schools have already instituted process changes in anticipation of the court decision. So there will be some changes, certainly, I'm sure, that will be made next year internally, but most of them were set up this year in anticipation of it. I think legacy, with or without the decision, was next on the chopping block. So this will just move it along a little quicker. But this was a conversation that we were having, pre case. And so one thing we saw, so Amherst, the places like the UCs and other state schools have been saying no legacy for a while, but it was Amherst, Hopkins, MIT, there were highly selective private schools that have come out and just said no more. Again, that train was already moving before the pandemic, but I do think that the case will certainly accelerate it, as will other things, by the way, like just the general landscape is moving toward, if you're moving towards equity, like this is a very easy and obvious place to start investigating and thinking about a little bit differently. And so I feel like, testing was sort of the first thing, and we saw that, it's nuanced even there. I think this is much the same.
And what do you think are the tip factors for successful applicants?
I think it's all about, I know it's all about the fit, and it's how you express it. Like you have that, your opportunity in your applications, the only opportunity you get to speak is in your essay. You have your main essay, which goes everywhere, no difference. But your supplemental essays, those are the most important. If a school has one, some of them don't have, in which case, obviously they're relying on the main essay, but I think the most missed opportunities for people are in those supplements. I think people's sense of what is a tailored supplemental essay is so far from what actually is a tailored essay. You can't just change the pronouns of, like the professors and the names and the clubs and the research person you want to work with and whatever, and think that that's actually tailored. And I also think that the engagement, and not just what you do, but how you do it and what you get out of it, and the kinds of things you're choosing to engage in always have been important, but they're sort of like the center of the process at this point. You cannot be, the reason I was saying before with the testing, to take those box checks and run with it, is that that's a perfect example. If you're just a box checker, meaning valedictorian, 35 or 36 on the ACT, X, Y, and Z and A, B, and C activities that are all sounding good and, like high level, you're gonna have a hard time. Like if those essays aren't individually tailored, it's crazy, but there are so many of those students, it's very hard to differentiate. And again, I think people's sense of what's a differentiator is not, it's just people box checking that they've done all the right things, which again, not that long ago would have been sufficient. But they are able to be so incredibly picky given their applicant pools. And so to me, the real hook and the real sort of tip factors are all about how you present yourself and how you plan your pre-years in high school, grade 9 ideally, but 10th and 11th grade. Because again, if you just sort of do all the right things and you're writing about all the things you've done, I don't think you're going to be very happy with the outcome.
And I think Bari's still talking about that difference between what you can do ahead of time and what you do at the end to strategize, right? So those boxes that you need to check, you do need to check them also, she's saying, which is what has made this such
very
a
important
process.
Check,
right?
and continue and
right. And those are, and what we're talking about, all those things that we thought were exceptional when we were applying, et cetera, being the tour guide and being the valedictorian and all those things. That is all checking the boxes. And I just want to be so clear, because we spend so long talking about testing, but the biggest box that you're checking is that transcript. They are seeing your high school transcript. They are seeing 9th grade 10th grade, 11th and 12th, beginning of 12th, and depends on how your school works, but they're sending senior year grades as well. And those are not optional. So we have no out there, and they are by far the biggest like box to check. So what we're saying is, on top of all those things that our kids work so hard on, I think my daughter will have to find a new path because this is very difficult. My son too, but beyond being these amazing kids, right? They're developing things looking ahead that will help them really stand out. But then what Bari's saying, which is so important, is once you get to the end, that application is kind of all of it. It's the whole game after you've done those really important 4 years, or 3.5 years, because that's the only thing they see. And as a parent, it's so hard because you've seen 4 years, but they see what they see, which is that high school transcript, scores if you're sending them, those, right? This application, which has this very short Common App and some room for your extracurriculars, and then these supplementary essays, which, as Bari said, people think are an afterthought, but are in fact the whole game. And they don't come out until, August-ish, right, of application season senior year. So, they're a very important piece of that for our current juniors. That's a thing that's coming. That's a very important piece of this, if not the most important piece.
Yeah, and you don't want to work on it, by the way, until then either. They come out a little bit late for some people's tastes, but the truth is you want to be the most developed version of yourself, and hopefully you're really doing what you need to be doing during the summer to kind of pull things together or to accelerate certain things or whatever. So you don't want to be sitting there writing essays in April and May of junior year, because most kids, we hope, are quite different people in September and October. And some students will have some early drafts that they might work on, like with an English class assignment or something. And then, when they look at it in September, they're like, I could do better than that. Like, this isn't capturing me, because you're changed over the time, since then. It's not a very long period of time, but for a high school junior becoming a high school senior, there's a lot going on during that time period. So you kind of want to manage the getting ahead without kind of moving a little too fast, so you don't do yourself justice. And also one just quick thing is that this, all what you're doing and how you do it, I think also people have this perception that when I say something like that, they're thinking, how big does it need to be? Like, what else? And I agree, by the way, they expect an unrealistic and unfair amount from young people. Make no mistake about it. I'll be the first person, and anyone who's spoken with me directly knows I've said that. But, I don't make the rules, right? I wish I did. It would look a lot different if I made them, but I don't. My job is to make it more transparent so that you can make the best decisions for yourself. But I think people's perception of what actually plays well is also a bit off. It doesn't have to be something big. In fact, it's better when it isn't usually, but you have to be thoughtful about what that thing is. And again, how you're presenting it and presenting it differently for different schools. But I don't want people to feel like, oh my God, I have to come up with this big thing. It's not that, but it does need to be thoughtful and intentional.
Do you have advice on selecting a major for our application and admissions purposes?
It's a great question, and it's something also that has changed a bit over time. I think I don't care in general, like, no, I don't care. If you're going to be, I don't care if you're undecided versus you say something. Even if you say something, though, there's almost most schools will have some kind of academic interest question, and they expect you to have some thoughts and opinions about what you like better than not, right? Like, or what you don't like. So you're not necessarily saying, I want to major in this. You might say, I'm undecided, but I find early American history, and this particular thing, especially interesting, X, blah, blah, blah. By the way, never just say you find something fascinating or interesting. That was a bad example off the top of my head. But anyway, you can do that. But then, so I don't necessarily care, but then there are some majors that are harder to kind of stand out in. And there are some majors, because some schools will admit by major or by school, where that major or that school within the university will be more difficult. So if you're interested in business, I would think hard about, do you need an undergraduate business degree? And the answer may very well be yes, but like, do you need that right now? Do you think you're going to be doing an MBA anyway, likely, given what you think your career path would be? Are you not necessarily sure what business is? Because if you go the business route, it's almost always going to be harder, more difficult to get in. And more importantly, what's more important to you? Being an undergraduate business program or getting into a certain level of school? There's no right or wrong answer, but you need to figure that out. If the answer is, I need to go to a college with an undergraduate business program, that's different than saying, listen, it would be nice, but I want to be able to kind of go to X or Y level and, I'm going to go after that. So I do think that I do think that even when you're one of those people where you have interests, but you're not like locked into something, you want to think carefully about which major or majors you mention, or areas of academic interest that you mention and talk about. Because if all you're really going to be able to say in a role, kind of in a circle that, I find it fascinating and I find it interesting and it's what all this stuff, without the real engagement in it, and you have something else that maybe actually you don't think you're going to major in, or you're pretty certain you're not going to major in, but you just have a tighter story and more to say about it, you're better off going in that direction, just because the story will be more compelling. So you have to really think about what you have behind your options. So often, students are, going with the tighter story. I mean, that's what you should do, is you go with the tighter story, but sometimes there really is a technical aspect to it, differing admit rates for different majors or different schools within the university. And that is extraordinarily strategic, and also may differ amongst different schools on your list.
I'm going to go back to something that actually Sasha touched on, and she said, and I will cover this later, is how is the SAT going to be changing?
Yes, that College Board loves to change. I feel we've been through this every 10 years, forever. So for US kids and international students, if there's any of y'all out there, this is not for you. It's a little different for you. But for our kids here, the SAT is changing next year, i.e. 2024. This fall, you'll take a new PSAT, which we can talk about. They're launching their new PSAT, and then in the spring of 2024, they'll launch their new SAT, and it's substantially different. It's digital. It's not done on paper anymore. It's adaptive, which means there's 2 modules for the section, and how you do on the first module affects what you'll be given next. So it's a whole new ball game. And certainly the College Board has done this before, and they've released some materials on Khan Academy. And I know my really dear friends at Test Innovators are working so hard on amazing adaptive tests. Like I know it's all happening as it always does. But I would just go year by year and say, seniors, you're done testing. I hope you're very happy with where you're going in April. I'll send you a sweatshirt. And juniors, you've got as much time as you want. If you want to do the SAT, if you're doing the SAT, it's not changing for you. You're a junior, you'll be done by December. Your applications will be in by January 1st at the very latest, if not before. So have at the SAT if that's the test for you, or do the ACT, whichever you prefer. For, those parents, or for those kids who are currently in 10th grade or currently in 9th grade, well, let's talk 10th graders first. You have a little bit of time. You have, just like those juniors, you have until the end of this year. And for most kids, as we just discussed in terms of the timing of when we take official tests, that's not going to be doable, right? We're going to need more time than that. And as Bari and I talked about, there are those kids who are nearly fluent in SAT when they come to us sophomore year. And if you're nearly fluent and you'd like to test on the old SAT this calendar year again, and you're a sophomore, have at it. But if you're a sophomore who needs that long runway, which most kids do, if you're a sophomore who will likely be testing into junior year, spring and fall of your senior year, which, as we talked about, is very commonplace, I would probably look very closely at the ACT, because of what Bari said. In a world that's getting harder and harder, let's go for predictable. That's my thing. I just want predictable. And if you're already fluent, then everything, it's already predictable for you. But I have no I just want to test I know. I want to test with stable materials. I want to test I can predict. I want to test that my tutors have analyzed. And the SAT is brand new next year. So I would stay away from it with some few exceptions if you're a current 10th grader or a parent of a current 10th grader. And there are exceptions, and there will be exceptions. And for those kids, there will be materials, and there will be tutors who understand it, but not as well. None of them will understand it as well as they understand the ACT. That's impossible. And though there will be materials, there's already 8 practice tests online right now, there will not be 25 of them. And a lot of the materials will not be good. So, yes, it's doable. It's not the predictable thing. And working with digital and adaptive, it's a whole new world. We were expecting it as, like a lot of these things, we know it's coming. ACT announced online, and then they took it back during COVID. And so for now, I think if you're a 10th grader, you need to have a real serious look at the ACT. And 9th graders, let's give it some time. You'll likely have a choice between a digital SAT and either a paper ACT or a digital ACT when the time comes. But for now, that's sort of what is coming, and what I sort of recommend. Does that make any other questions on the SAT? I know there were some in the Q&A as well.
There are some, so I'll ask you a couple that I have here. So
okay.
One of the questions is, I know the new SAT is unknown, but would it hurt to just take it and see how you do, not report it if it's awful?
Yeah. So, I'm of so many minds of this. First of all, nobody in my mind, like if I think about, again, my daughter, like I'm never throwing her into anything she's not prepared for. That's just the way that I want my kid. I want all of our students and my kids to feel like whatever they're positioned to do, they have tools to do it. And so taking a cold Khan Academy diagnostic with no stakes, or coming and taking an SAT, yeah, see how you do. There's 0 stakes. We can explore it. But taking an official test, going and waking up early and giving up a Saturday when you have a research paper due on Monday and taking it, there's low risk, there's low reward. Okay, that's just a cold. You're taking that new language, that new game that you've never tried before. You probably aren't going to hit any scores that help you. Psychologically, that depends on your kid. Some kids are like, yeah, let's do it. And I don't care how I do. I know I'm not going to send them. I can throw them away. And other kids are just devastated by seeing scores that are not what they want. So it's not my general advice to ever take anything kind of cold like that, unless it's just a diagnostic. I'm a planner, and I like to have all the tools, and I like kids to be positioned to know what they're doing and to feel grounded in something. But there's low risk in taking an official SAT. I don't want to overstate that. And remember, you can't do that yet. You can take a Khan Academy one, and lots of kids have, and that's great. You can try that out. You cannot take an official new SAT yet, and you won't be able to until March of 2024. That's just not available.
Yeah. And it's, will the ACT testing format remain the same in the coming years, unlike the ACT for now?
For now, internationally, they're already online. So I don't think we're that far away from the ACT going digital, but going digital is very different than going digital and adaptive, right? So like putting the ACT on a computer doesn't change that much. For some kids, it'll change things more, for some less, but that's not the game changer for me. It's a whole new structure of a test that needs to be replicated and understood in a very strategic, specific way to be able to move those scores. And anyone who says they know how to do that perfectly right now is not telling the truth. It's just not possible yet. And I know people, the best minds in our industry, are trying so hard to put that together so that kids have those resources. It always takes time. And maybe your kid is fluent in new SAT. And certainly my tutors are already getting fluent in it ahead of next year, but they're getting fluent for those kids who should take it, or for those sort of special kids who need that extra SAT help, and everyone else will take the ACT, which it has been the creeping trend anyway. 15 years ago, the SAT had the market share. Now, the ACT is the more popular of the tests. So like a lot of things Bari and I are saying, this is sort of an acceleration of some things that have already been true. It continues to be.
And then a couple of
Yeah,
other,
please go ahead.
one other follow-up question for one of the things we talked about. Don't schools see through the strategic angle of what you choose 9 to 12, i.e. they can see through the kid who works with underprivileged kids and teach squash or tutor. It all seems very calculated. Well, it's all calculated if that's what you do, right? If you're just checking the boxes and saying, I'm going to do this, but you don't really care about it, and you're not a bad person if your heart isn't in any one of these things. We all have different things that motivate us and make us feel good and useful. Then yeah, and I say it all the time, like, do what you like, because they're gonna be able to see through it in those essays. When you have somebody who is talking about like what they did and says all the right things, and then you have an essay for somebody who really gives a crap about what they're talking about, that other person's always going to lose. This isn't like a memo for an office or a paper for class where you can BS your way through pretty easily. It's more personal. There's more depth, and like there are people who actually are doing things they care about. And again, that person who's just the box checker is always going to lose. You can write a beautifully sounding essay, but real feeling, real emotion, real connection, like as good as you think you are, you're not that good. Like, especially when you're reading tens of thousands of these, you're not that good. So do the things that you like. If you're going to do it calculated, of course it's going to come through, but I would advise you to do different things. And it's okay to do things where I often will say to students, listen, I know if you didn't have to do this, you'd be hanging with your friends or taking a nap. So would I, by the way, right? But knowing that you have to do it, here are, there's like unlimited options, which is great and also very overwhelming at times. But given that you know that you need to do something and it's just good for you anyway, right? It's good for all of us. What do you like? Where's the interest? And there's no value judgment on different things. So I would encourage you not to approach it like a calculation, because it will absolutely come through in the end.
And that's so the difference between how you spend those 3.5 years and what happens in the application. They're both so important. How you spend the time is everything. And then what you do with how you spend the time is where a lot of kids go wrong, right? At the end, but how you spend what you're truly passionate about. And I know I have some seniors who are deferred, who are just truly amazing kids who are going to get into a lot of places. And I know it because they really did the thing for 3.5 years. And I know that a deferral can be difficult, by the way, for you seniors out there. Like, I know a deferral can be crushing, but I also know a kid who has put all those things in and has shown it, and colleges see that, and it'll be okay for those kids. It's always those kids who do win in that pile. And I can see it, Bari can see it, the applications, the admissions people are trained to find that and to see that.
It's just also, you're reading so many, like, you have to remember what it's like on the other side of this. And so again, things that would fly in an English class or a history class, or, for even at work for parents who are involved in the essay process, it's just not going to cut it here. And so you really want to be doing those things that that speak to you in some way. And it's not just what you do and why you're doing it, it's what you get out of it, which I don't think people think about enough.
It's amazing, and absolutely wonderful advice. I don't want to leave anything on the table. Can we just check any questions that might have come up? But like, that is just such an incredible summation of someone's high school career that I'm touched, I kind of want to end there.
I mean, really, truly, like, be you. Like, I have when you walk in to our house, there's a sign, a frame, print, whatever, and it says, you do you, boo. I'm like, that's the message I want my kids to see every time they come in the door. And I get that directly from my work. It's like, be you. It's actually like the most interesting version you can tell. And when I thought about what do I want to put at the front, there were a lot of options, but I was like, that's what I want them to see every time they walk in the door. And I would give the same advice to everyone out there.
I saw a quick question in the Q&A just logistically about diagnostic testing. If you're a parent of a sophomore, if you're a sophomore, I would try the old SAT, see where you are, try the ACT, and you're probably going in the ACT because you probably don't have time. You can try a new SAT on Khan Academy, but most of my sophomores will either skip an SAT diagnostic or do the old one and see where they are. And remember, just to be, again, optimistic, a lot of these kids were going to do ACT anyway. So yes, I know the SAT is crazy and it's changing, but we were just talking about those stats, and my stats are, it's 70% ACT anyway. So because it's a predictable test that you can beat, and our kids want to predictable when it gets hard. And I think now the SAT, I don't know why the College Board does what they do, but they've just done the opposite of what I would do if I were the College Board. They've destabilized their test and they've made it less predictable. And if you're in this game of an inflated thing, like, you want predictability. So sophomores, I wouldn't mind you skipping diagnostics altogether on the SAT and just going in the ACT, or you try an old SAT, ACT we compare. We can look at the new SAT if that's really a problem. There's a lot of options for you, but you probably weren't going to pick the SAT anyway, because it was always so unpredictable. And I just don't like unpredictable. So
I think, to use your what you were saying earlier, to jump in, it's a harder language to learn, I find, for students. It's not that it's impossible, but it's if you don't already have some level of fluency with it, it's a harder language to get.
And I will say, my math and science tutors, they hear me say the exact same thing all day, and they get mad at me because the ACT math is harder in content than the SAT traditionally, and the science is a big pain. It's an extra thing. Whatever my math and science tutors say, they know what I know, which is both of those torturous math and science sections are predictable, and they are predictably torturous. And I think that that's still good for our kids, and I see it in their scores all the time. So yes, the ACT it's not a fun language. I just want to be clear. Like Barry, I don't make the rules, and if I did, I would make them differently. But I like to be transparent about those, and the ACT is just a language that is, I think, very predictable to learn, as Barry was saying.
And Leslie, if you want, I'm sure people have some interest in some stats from.
Yeah, I was about to say, could you share what you have in terms of statistics?
Absolutely. I'll move around a little bit, but I'll try to kind of put things in certain groups so it's easier to digest. But let's start out by saying that there are a small number of schools, highly selective ones, that have decided to not release data. That was something that was kind of kicked off by Stanford a handful of years ago, but other schools have jumped on that bandwagon. Their thought is that it's better not to add sort of fuel to the fire in saying how low their admit rate is. But I think it kind of often makes people more anxious because they say it's so low, they won't even say it. So it's well-intentioned, but Penn, Princeton, Columbia, Stanford, Cornell, no data released. But interestingly, Brown in their early poll, so they had a 10% increase in applications over last year, and they denied 67% of the early decision pool. Now, people might be clutching their chests right now, but I think that is fantastic. Thank you, Brown, for being courageous enough to let people go when you know you're never taking them. It is a very hard decision. It feels extraordinarily harsh, like someone slapped you across the face when you get it. But at least after you recover from that initial shock, you know, okay, I need to move on. Either I need to, decide on an ED2 school, or I want to just sort of start thinking about the other places that I really like, as opposed to holding on for something that's never coming. So it's tough when you get that like strong of a response, but it's mostly because other places aren't as courageous to do it. And even when I was in admissions, we had students where we would write literally like on their file, defer to deny. We were just trying to let you down easier. We were trying to be nice, but it is not actually nicer for the student. It's much more gracious and student-centered to let them off initially if that's what's going to happen. So they denied 67%. They only deferred 19%. And they had about a 13 to 14% admit rate in early. And so that's really interesting. On the other side, Harvard admitted about 7.6%. They denied, 7.6%. They denied only 9.5%. And then they deferred 78%. So it's almost like a flip. Harvard's deferring 78% of EA applicants. They have a restricted early action, and only denying 9.5%, which we know so many more are easy denies, right? So it's an interesting way to look at two Ivies doing it very, very differently. Another thing, just a couple of other things. So ED apps were up. Brown, I mentioned 10%. This is the 5th year in a row that there have been increases. Duke was up 20%, Dartmouth 14%, Tufts up 6%, but they were up 37% over the last 3 years. So that's sort of a pre and post-pandemic interesting sort of combination or comparison. Yale up 35% compared to 3 years ago, UVA up 22%. Northeastern up 38%. These are in the ED pools and EA in the case of any place that has restricted early action, which of those last ones are none. Places that had some good news, higher admit rates this year in ED. Everything is not going in the other direction. Vanderbilt was 24.1% this year versus 17.6% last year. Northeastern 39% versus 33%, so they were up 6 points. Boston College 30% versus 28% last year. BU 29 versus 26. Georgetown 12% versus 10%. MIT 5.7% versus 4.7%, but don't worry, Caltech held steady at 4% last year and this year. And WashU, a bigger increase from 27% last year to 35% this year. They have an ED2 round as well that's coming out soon. But it's interesting to see, again, most places went down either a bit or more than a little bit, but there are places where there was an increase in admit rate even when apps went up. And then one thing I think also interesting is that percentage of the class admitted ED. So Duke said it was about 45 to 46% of their class, but at some small liberal arts college, the percentage of the class coming in ED is going down pretty significantly, like anywhere from 10 or more % of the class. It used to be, let's say, high 50s or closer to 50, and now it's going into the high 30s and into the low 40s. And those places include Bates, Middlebury, Wesleyan, Swarthmore, Colgate, Pitzer. So also, again, depending on what schools and what kinds of schools you're looking at, ED, always the easier to get in, not easy, but always going to be sort of the better odds. But also something worth calculating when you're thinking about options for regular. And I have some other stuff, but I think it's enough for now. But I think you can see it. Listen, it's changing. Things are kind of still moving, in a certain direction, but the more information you have, the better you can strategize for yourself.
Great. I think you have shared so much information. I want to thank you very, very much, but I also want everyone to know that you are definitely available to them. It doesn't just end here. And I believe Bari will be sending out a recording as well. So thank you very, very much, Sasha and Bari.
So much.
Yeah.
Thanks to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We had a wonderful turnout, and we're always happy to share information. Have a good night, everybody.